Hello, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Kevin Kosar, and I'm a senior fellow here at AEI. For those of you who are watching this event on C-SPAN or online, I want to share that the American Enterprise Institute is a think tank in Washington, D.C. AEI is dedicated to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world. AEI is a nonpartisan, nonprofit 501c3 educational organization. AEI does not take institutional positions on any issues. AEI scholars are free to follow the evidence and to come to their own individual conclusions. At AEI, we welcome open debate and we cherish intellectual freedom. And for those of you who are here in person, I thank you much for braving the smoke that's descended upon the city caused by the Canadian wildfires. Thank you for coming in person, and I will resist the temptation to make a jest about Foggy Bottom becoming Smoggy Bottom. So today's event is on Philip Wallach's new book, Why Congress, which was published by Oxford University Press. This event is part of the Edward and Helen Hintz book forums at AEI. These forums provide a platform to host prominent authors for discussion of their books on issues of national significance. We're very grateful to Edward and Helen Hintz for their tremendous support of AEI and their deep commitment to our mission. Now, the roadmap for this program, which runs about 75 minutes, is that Philip will come up to the lectern and speak for about 10 minutes on his book, copies of which you will see are over there. Next, Phil will rejoin me and our two distinguished guests in the blue chairs, and I'll moderate a discussion between us that'll go on till about 5 p.m. Then we'll open the floor to questions. Now, let me conclude my introductory time at the lectern by introducing you all to Phil and his two interlocutors. Phil's a senior fellow here at AEI. Previously, he worked as a senior fellow at the R Street Institute and the Brookings Institution. He also served as a fellow on the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress back in 2019. He earned his doctorate in politics from Princeton University and is the author of two books, Why Congress and To the Edge, Legality, Legitimacy, and the Responses to the 2008 Financial Crisis. Seated at the far end there is Daniel Lipinski. Dan's a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Pope Leo XIII Fellow on Social Thought at the University of Dallas. He represented the 3rd District of Illinois in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2005 to 2021. His career was quite distinguished. Congressman Lipinski earned a doctorate in political science from Duke University and is the author of Congressional Communication, Content and Consequences. In the middle, we have Reid Ribble, the inaugural practitioner in residence in political science at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. He too served in Congress and served well. He represented the 8th District of Wisconsin in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2011 to 2017. And after retiring from the House, Congressman Ribble served as the CEO of the National Roofing Contractors Association for 5 years. With that, let me step away from the lectern and bring up our guest, Phil Wallach.
Just want to start by thanking everyone who braved the smoke today and is here in person. It's a real honor to have you all gathered together, and to thank the American Enterprise Institute for providing really such a wonderful professional home for me where I could write this book. I want to start off by reading the epigraph of my book, which seems like a strange thing to do, but I really find it pretty inspirational and helps give a sense of why I'm involved in this project. So it comes from this book, In Defense of Politics by Bernard Crick, and it goes like this. Boredom with established truths is a great enemy of free men. So there's some excuse in troubled times not to be clever and inventive in redefining things, or to pretend to academic unconcern or scientific detachment, but simply to try to make some old platitudes pregnant. Politics, like Antaeus in the Greek myth, can remain perpetually young, strong, and lively, so long as it can keep its feet firmly on the ground of Mother Earth. So Crick is a great defender of politics as its own thing, and that's actually the very beginning of his book. And not in the next paragraph, he goes on to say something about how we should think of politics. Politics is too often regarded as a poor relation, inherently dependent and subsidiary. It is rarely praised as something with a life and character of its own. Politics is not religion, ethics, law, science, history, or economics. It neither solves everything, nor is it present everywhere, and it is not any one political doctrine, such as conservatism, liberalism, socialism, communism, or nationalism, though it can contain elements of most of these things. Politics is politics, to be valued as itself, not because it is like or really is something else more respectable or peculiar. Politics is politics. Politics is often a dirty word in contemporary usage. It's an epithet. If something is political, that means it's bad. And part of my effort in writing this book is to rehabilitate the idea of politics as something that free people do, and the best way that we have to keep social peace in a context of profound differences between the people of our country. We need to learn how to cope with difference and manage it and regulate it, and not hope that we can suppress it or pretend that it doesn't exist. And so a big theme of the book is why Congress is the place where we need to deal with difference. Why in the American constitutional system, Congress is really the one institution that allows the manyness of America to have its say, and to allow these different factions to come up against each other, and hopefully, in the process of figuring out how to accommodate each other, actually produce policies and solutions for the challenges facing our country better than anything that one group would come up with all on its own. So this is not a new idea, as the epigraph said. I don't pretend to any inventiveness, really. This goes straight back to something surely most of you were taught in civics class at some point from James Madison and Federalist Number 10. So Madison and his co-authors of the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and Jay, are very concerned with how are we going to make this country hang together, because as the Constitution was in the balance, they were worried that this young project, the United States of America, was not long for the world. And they were centrally concerned with the problem of how can we get this diverse republic full of people divided by class interests, regional interests, creedal differences. How can we get them all to live together in relative harmony rather than falling to pieces? And Madison in Federalist 10 provides this very famous answer about the extended republic. He talks about having sufficient diversity of factions that they will essentially check each other and keep any one from predominating, and thereby make sure that we cannot have tyranny of the majority or tyranny of any one group. And I won't go into that in detail because you've probably all heard that a million times. Suffice it to say, I think that Madison's arguments in Federalist 10 are really more profound than they're given credit for. I think an awful lot of people in our current politics believe that somehow we can suppress difference, and we can deal with the fact that people disagree by somehow making us all into one people who agrees on everything. I think Madison's route is far more realistic and far more profound. But turning to practicalities, Madison pretty quickly found that it's not simply enough to put these factions in contact with each other and mix it up and hope everything turns out all right. And Madison in the Second Congress became concerned that amidst sort of factional chaos, the sort of giant special interest of his day was coming to predominate. And he worried about the Bank of the United States and its allies specifically. And so Madison, as a member of Congress, wrote to his friend Thomas Jefferson, and he said he worried that the stock jobbers were becoming the Praetorian band of the government, at once its tool and its tyrant, bribed by its largesses and overawing it by clamors and combinations. I love, they really had a lot of flair back then. So Madison worries that if there's not some kind of organization put on this factional interplay in the Congress that he's an active member of, a leading member of, that it's going to just sort of open the door to predation by interest. And so Madison, who worried so much about faction, is sort of, a little bit ironically, one of the fathers of political parties, and helps to create the Republican Party as a counterbalance to Hamilton's party, essentially, the Federalists in Congress. And we shouldn't pretend that that just made everything work out smoothly in and of itself. The 1790s were an exceptionally nasty decade of politics in American history. But that's not my subject today. I'm just going to sort of say we see a situation where we need to organize faction in Congress, but partisan organization introduces its own problems. Let me fast forward about 8 decades to another famous observer of Congress. That is the political scientist Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, as a doctoral student at Johns Hopkins University, wrote a book that became probably the best-selling work of American political science in history. And it's called Congressional Government. Most people remember it today for a famous pronouncement that Congress in committee is Congress at work. That's sort of the most famous pronouncement. But Wilson wasn't just writing a textbook. The book is quite polemical, and he's very concerned that the Congress of his day was, again, a place where special interests were predating on the American people, that all sorts of deliberation was happening in committee rooms behind closed doors. There were no open committee hearings at that time, and that the committees would write legislation which would promptly be signed into law after passing on the House and Senate floors without much real substantive debate. And we once again had a situation where the parties, which Wilson thought were rather bankrupt in terms of their principles, sort of running on fumes from the Civil War largely. And he worried that that was basically leaving American politics adrift. And Wilson articulated very powerfully an alternative vision, very much different from Madison's in Federalist Number 10, where Madison was celebrating complexity and this multiplicity of faction as a solution to possible tyranny. Wilson wants clean lines such that we can have accountability. And he believed that what we needed was the parties can deal with faction internally, and then they can present the American people with a clean choice. And at election time, the American people will decide. They will charge one of these parties, which has given a clear message, with governing the country, and then that party should be given a chance to implement its agenda and pay attention to the finer details of administration. It's remarkable the extent to which Wilson's prescriptions actually got followed in the decades after he wrote, well before he ever emerged as a major political figure in his own right. In the 1880s and 1890s, we moved toward a system of very strong partisan control of the House under Speaker Reid, known as Czar Reid, and his successor in the first decade of the 20th century was one of the most colorful figures in American history, really, who I wish was not such an obscurity today, Joseph Gurney Cannon, known as Boss Cannon. And he was somebody who was raised in the sort of wilds of western Indiana in the 1840s, but here he was a dominant figure in the first decade of the 20th century. He always had a cigar hanging out of the corner of his mouth, and he sort of played up his hayseed nature as a way of dealing with the press. But he was a very shrewd political operator and became the dominant figure in Washington for a time. And if I can, I need a clicker. There's a clicker somewhere. Thank you. Okay, I'm not showing you a slideshow, but I have this one political cartoon, which is practically my favorite part of the whole book. This is a cartoon, and the caption of it, I better get it right. The caption says, "The House in session according to the minority point of view." That's what's in the script up at the top there. And I'm not sure, for those viewers online and on C-SPAN, in case you can't see it, I'll just describe the picture. This is Joseph Gurney Cannon presiding over the chamber of the House. And he says, "The gentleman from Illinois is recognized." That's him. The gentleman from Illinois is him, and the House is full of him. It's full of dozens and dozens or scores and scores of carbon copies of Joseph Gurney Cannon, such that the House in session consists of doing what Mr. Cannon wants. So we followed Wilson's advice to a remarkable degree, and we ended up in this situation where we had a dominant party with a pretty clear agenda, very clear differences between the party after the election of 1896, right, where we have William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan. And Cannon is sort of for the business orthodoxy of the day, and he's the dominant figure. But that comes with the problem of a sort of stifling orthodoxy. This is a time of the Second Industrial Revolution, very rapid social change, and Congress can't keep up when things are just Joseph Gurney Cannon trying to say how things should be. And eventually, he faces a seminal moment in Congress, an insurgency from progressive Republicans in his party who bolt and join forces with the Democrats, overthrow his dominance. He had been presiding over the Rules Committee in addition to being the Speaker, and he's stripped of that power. And soon enough, things are blown open. Congress operates on a very different principle for many decades, a sacrosanct seniority principle where committee chairmen become the real power centers rather than the Speaker, and that's a decentralized model of Congress. So the book tries to give a sense that Congress is a place with a long history. It's a place where there have been vicissitudes in trying to deal with this problem of faction, trying to make sense of how we can play factions off against each other in productive ways. We sometimes end up in a land like this where we have stifling orthodoxy. Other times we end up feeling like the place has become kind of a decentralized, chaotic mess. And we need to start to reimpose some order, perhaps through centralization. So that's all I wanted to show for my picture show. I'm just going to gesture at really most of the meat chapters of the book, but I wanted to get that basic conceptual idea out there. I'm sure we'll have a lot of time to talk about contemporary politics in the discussion. But the main part of the book sort of goes from the 1970s to today and looks at how we've gotten from a place that was in the 1970s became a radically decentralized chamber to today. It's a place dominated by very Cannon-like figures, at least until very recently. Maybe things today are changing, and we'll talk about that. But it's a place where centralized leadership has called the shots to a remarkable degree and structured the agenda, and given a sense that we don't really have a very interesting interplay of factions. We have two clusters of factions who know how to yell at each other and insult each other and don't always know how to work together except when they absolutely have to. When, to be fair, then they do. The argument of the book is that we're in a moment where the stifling orthodoxies enforced by these centralized leaders really give our politics a sense of not being adequate to the challenges of the moment, which are very real. And they tend to push policymaking elsewhere in our government. Power abhors a vacuum, and if Congress doesn't act, the executive branch largely picks up the slack. And unfortunately, the executive branch is not a good place to represent the manyness of this country. We end up with profound legitimacy problems when we try to have agency bureaucrats solve all our problems through creative interpretation of old statutes. We really need to continually renew our sense of self-government, take ownership for what happens, what the federal government does, and the best way for us to do that is to feel like we trust the members that we send to Congress, and we believe in the process by which they mix it up with each other and work out accommodations and find solutions. They won't always be pretty solutions. They won't even always be good laws. My argument is not that if we empowered Congress better and got it to be a more assertive branch, it would always do the right thing. That would be a crazy argument to make. I don't believe that. But overall, why Congress? Because by investing in the political process, by investing in this ideal of self-government, that's how we renew our commitment to being a free people. That's how we secure social peace better than any other way we know. And that's really how our constitutional system is meant to function, and how, we need to make the choice for Madisonian politics once again in order, I think, to keep our country from falling to pieces. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Phil. Let me first start with Congressman Lipinski. Phil spoke of Congress, and I think we could say especially the House, as being a place that's supposed to be a bunch of diverse interests being piled into the same forum, and then having to work things out amongst themselves, which can, as Phil hinted, can go two basic ways. Either they cancel each other out and nothing happens, or they somehow bargain out a compromise that enough of them can live with that it can then move on to the next chamber. Was that happening when you were in Congress? Was that happening much, a lot, not much at all? What was your experience?
Well, let me start, since Phil read from the rep. Let me read this from a distinguished academic and public servant, the blurb on the back of the book. While few would claim that the contemporary Congress is uniting the nation or solving our most vexing problems, Wyatt Congress lays out a convincing case that this is exactly what the institution was designed to do, has done in the past, and could do once again. And let me tell you, as we all know, it's not doing that right now. So many different thoughts come to mind as Phil was speaking, and unfortunately, way too many. One, I was thinking, did anyone ever redo that cartoon they should have with Nancy Pelosi? that would have been absolutely perfect. Look, I've said the biggest change that I've seen. I studied Congress before I ran for Congress as a political scientist, and the biggest change that I think has happened over the last few decades is it used to be after every election, federal election every 2 years, everyone in Washington, House members, senators, would look around and say, okay, who has majority in the House, who has the majority in the Senate, who controls the White House? What can we do over the next year and a half, maybe, together? What can we work on for the betterment of the country before we fight it out in the next election? Today, after the election every 2 years, what happens, everyone looks around, says who controls what, and says, what can we do in the next 2 years so our party can get control of everything and shove down the throats of the other side exactly what we want. This is not how Congress is supposed to operate. Congress, as I was coming over here, I saw a tweet. Representative Scott Perry was asked today about have they resolved this impasse. Right now, the House is stuck. Some members of the Freedom Caucus blocked the rule on some bill that all the Republicans wanted. They asked Scott Perry, has that been resolved? And he says, it doesn't matter that much. That was just a messaging bill. And the person who tweeted this, Jake Sherman, said, well, that's all the House is doing right now. I've argued that's all the House has done since 2011. The House has taken itself out of, to a large extent, legislating. And the big problem is, as Phil said, is we're not really, Congress is supposed to take all these ideas from the diverse country. And I mean, this book is just really incredible. It's the book I wish I would have written. I'm glad Phil had to put all the work in to do it. He did a better job than I probably would have. But it's so important, but I think so few people understand this, what the role of Congress is supposed to be. It's supposed to be representatives who come and bring the views of their constituents to Washington. The Constitution set up Congress to debate, deliberate, come to some conciliation. And it is not doing that. Now, some may say, well, that's just because the country is so split. That's part of the reason, but Congress was meant to, and it can, as Phil says in this book, it could help bring the country together if we actually let representatives, senators do their job, instead of having just, it's either a red way or a blue way, and there's no other choices. Individual members don't get to have too much of a say in it. We're just trying to, if we're in the minority, we're not trying to have a say. We want to shame the other side so we can win the next election. I remember, I'll tell one story and then I'll let Reid go. I mean, the two of us could go for a long time, so I have to shut myself up here. Best illustration of this, one of the best, 2013, government shutdown, October of 2013. There was a group of us. I was a member of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus. There was a group of us getting together, Democrats, Republicans, figuring out what can we possibly put forward that help get us out of, get the government funded again. We understood that the Republicans had sort of painted themselves in a corner. House Republicans said, get rid of the Affordable Care Act, or government doesn't get funded. And we're trying to figure out some way through this. And some of the Democratic members, not me, because leadership knew they couldn't really sway me, I was too independent, but I started hearing from my Democratic colleagues, yeah, I got a call from leadership to stop trying to do this. We don't want the government, essentially the message is we don't want the government reopened because this makes Republicans look really bad. And so we don't want to help them get out of this problem. And that is just illustrative of the way things are. Now, what happened? Republicans finally got something done, opened the government. They did look bad, but then the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare website crashed, and then it all flipped to the other side. But that's so much of what the House, especially, the Senate works a little bit, but that's what the House is about, messaging, and that just takes away the people's voice, and that was certainly my experience.
How about you, Reid? In your experience, did you see these diverse interests working out things amongst one another? Did they have the space to do that? Or was it primarily kind of a red shirt versus blue shirt scrum?
Depends on who in the Congress we're speaking of. Dan and I spoke frequently, became very good friends when I was there. But I will tell you, there was something very, I guess, informed a lot of my thinking in Congress. I was there for about 4 months, and I'd never served in any political office before being elected even though my good buddy here tossed that group of that were elected in 2011 under the bus a second ago. That was me. But the reality was I was sitting with Scott Ridgell, who was a car dealer. I was a roofing contractor by trade. We were both business people, and we were sitting in the chamber for votes. And Scott leaned over to me and said, hey, have you met any Democrats yet? We'd been there 3 months. And in committee meetings, you go and you get sequestered. All the Republicans go in their room, all the Democrats go in their room, and there's no discussion between the two. And I said, no, I haven't met any. And he said, well, why don't we go meet some? And I said, I think that's a good idea. You go over there, they're all over, sitting over there. I said, just pick one, and I'll pick one, and we'll go out to dinner. And that's what we did. And I went over there, and I introduced myself to Congressman Jim Cooper, and Scott introduced himself to Congressman Kurt Schrader, and went out to dinner. And I was really curious about the dinner because I wanted to figure out how liberals think. I just didn't understand it. It turned out we picked two of the most moderate members in the chamber.
I was going to say, you picked
And so it was a
good
total
members.
fluke that happened. But we became really good friends. Congress functions in what a good friend of mine, another member of Congress told me, called it a pyramid of power. And everybody is working to climb up on top of the pyramid. At the very top of that pyramid is the Speaker of the House, and right below the Speaker of the House are the majority leaders and majority and minority whips. They're there. And then directly below them are the committee chairmen. But I would even say directly below the whips and the majority and minority leaders, it's really the staff directors of the committees. Then below them are the committee chairmen. Then below them are the legislative directors on your staff. And then at the bottom of the pyramid is everybody else, all the members. We had no power whatsoever. Everything was driven from the top. And I was in the majority the whole time. Speaker John Boehner was the speaker, and he basically governed the Republican caucus using the Hastert rule. And the Hastert rule was nothing will come to the floor of the House unless it's got the majority of the majority supporting it. At that point, it can move forward. However, when Ryan became speaker, and I don't think this was deliberate, I think it was the nature of what had happened in the members that were sent there, it pretty much got to a point where nothing came to the floor unless we could pass it on our own. So unless we had 218 Republican votes, we didn't want to basically get anybody mad, and so nothing could happen without that. So what that meant then was that everything was directed from the top, and we even had less power in that case. And so I'm struck by the Congress's unwillingness to jealously and vigorously guard their authority under Article 1 of the Constitution. They are very willing to pass that authority off to a president. And two recent examples would be the U.S. Senate under President Trump was controlled by Republicans. And they just all kind of rolled over when President Trump didn't want us bother going through the process of advising consent for cabinet positions. So Trump just made up a bunch of acting secretaries. And the Senate just kind of rolled over on their back like puppies and waited for Trump to pat him there, in the tummy. And they just let him do whatever he wanted. And today, you've got the similar things going on with President Biden just, deciding, well, we're going to issue $20 billion of credits to student loans, and we're just going to forgive it. And the Congress got all the power of the purse, but they just refuse to hold on to and protect and guard their power, and it damages the institution. And so I think to get back to where the Congress is actually a representative body doing the work that the American people want, they're going to have to seize that power back from the executive branch, even when it's their guy or gal in the White House. They've got to be able to say no. It's nice, Mr. President or Madam President, that you've got this opinion, but we'll let you know when we send legislation over. If you like it, sign it. If you don't, veto it, and we'll take it from there. But they're just unwilling to protect their own authority. It's discouraging to be there and watch it unfold.
Yeah, I should say that, old enough to remember the Carter Presidency. I mean, you had a Democratic Congress, you had a Democratic president, but Congress was often just openly contemptuous of the White House, and it was contemptuous of it. And they fought amongst themselves frequently with the Republicans sitting on the side kind of watching the whole spectacle. And that these days is rare. And this is what I want to turn to you, Phil, because this issue of Congress giving up authority, the Constitution says it has. James Madison probably would be a bit perplexed by this. You know, much of his schema to some degree involves the kind of low motives of human beings wanting to hold and wield power as part of what keeps the separation of powers system, you know, working, is people want to guard the power that they have by virtue of being in the branch. Yet, as we all know, delegation, giving away of power, refusal to wield power has become regularized. Why do members do that? I mean, isn't power fun? Like, why don't they want to use it?
Yeah, the whole ambition counteracting ambition depends on sort of this individual sense of drive, and it has to be drive to do something and thus take the responsibility onto yourself rather than just ambition to be seen. That's where a lot of ambitions are channeled these days. And it can't just be ambition to help your party win the next election, right? That's really the thing that dominates our current political moment, is the sense that, oh, well, it really is so important for my party to win the next election. The ambition is, let's get our party in the White House where they're exercising the sort of real power in the system, and we'll take it from there, and we'll cheer them on when we have the real power, and we'll try to slow the other guys down when they have it. And yeah, I guess it's a source of hope for me, because I do think that, you know, Dan and Reid are not so unusual in feeling a lot of frustrations with just how useless members of Congress can feel sometimes, right? I think it's a very widely shared sense, and the people who get elected to Congress are talented, ambitious people. I don't think it's just a matter that we have all the wrong people elected to office, and there's something morally or in any other way defective about them. So I think people do feel frustrated, and they wish they could be more involved in a meaningful legislative process where they are helping to find sort of strange bedfellows across the aisle and making things happen. But they're willing at the same time to sit back and listen to their leaders when their leaders tell them, no, that's really not so helpful for the really important thing of winning the next election. And so part of the point of this book is just a plea to the members themselves. And the book ends with an open letter to members of Congress. And it pretty much just says, hey, aren't you ambitious? Don't you want to get something done for this country? Isn't this trend of centralization kind of played out? Haven't we had enough of the current political moment and a sense that we've kind of exhausted its possibilities? Don't you want to be a part of mixing it up and solving the country's problems in a more active way? Don't you want to be something more than a glorified telemarketer, as I know one of your former colleagues described the job? And I do think a lot of members really do want that, and so I'm hopeful that they can, draw some inspiration from the history of their own institution to know that Congress has functioned on very different operative principles and has been organized in different ways to help that kind of lawmaking happen in the past, and certainly could at this point as well.
So I want to go back to Congressman Lipinski. This image of the House not being the place where interests are able to work out amongst themselves, of being very driven from the top down. Is that a structural issue primarily that could be fixed by altering the kind of internal rules and structure of the chamber? Is that a partisanship issue? What is it?
It is driven by partisanship. It's driven by the divide in the country. But it is reinforced by the rules. And the Committee on Modernization of Congress, that's one of the things that I'd actually originally had the bill to create that. We're hoping to open things up. At the beginning of this Congress, some of the Freedom Caucus members, I had an op-ed in the Washington Post saying, they're talking about we need to open this process up. We want to say, more of a say in what's going on. We don't want just this to be top down. And I said, this is good. this is something that is interesting, though. They felt that, well, they want more of a say, and somehow they're going to have more control. I didn't quite understand that. But I'm all for opening things up. In the Problem Solvers Caucus, we were always trying to do that. We had, after the 2018 election, Democrats got the majority in the House, and the Problem Solvers Caucus had agreed on some rule changes that we were going to demand whichever party had won the majority in the 2018 election, there's going to be a new speaker no matter what. Paul Ryan said he was going to step down. And we said we're going to demand that there's some rule changes, open it up to more bipartisan, change the rules, open up to more bipartisan lawmaking. And unfortunately, we made a few small changes, but it's tough. It's really tough. At that time, almost everyone knew Nancy Pelosi is eventually going to be Speaker, and I don't want to upset Nancy. So we got some small things done. So it's partially the rules. A lot of it is, look, I'm sure, I would assume those members that this past week said, we're not going to pass a rule. You need to, in order to consider legislation on the floor, you need to pass a rule. Generally, the majority party votes for the rule. It says, this bill will come up. This is how much debate time. This is how many amendments, if any. Normally, the majority all votes for it. Minority votes against it. 11 Republicans said, we're not going to vote for this rule. We're upset that we feel that we didn't have enough input on the debt ceiling. And so they stopped that from moving forward. And I forgot my point where I was going with that one.
Well, can I pick it up for a second?
Yeah, go ahead. I was glad you had a look in your eye. You were ready to...
I just want to say, there's this point about the Freedom Caucus folks and the kind of blowing the chamber open. I agree. I liked an awful lot of the rhetoric from some of those folks back in January. But it has to be in service of coalition building, and the operative principle has to be persuasion. You actually have to imagine reaching out to your colleagues and meeting them where they stand and convincing them that they should do business with you. I think that the strange part, that these folks want to blow the floor open, have more of a chance to have their say on the floor, to offer amendments on the floor, and I'm all for that. But really, for Congress to sort of get its mojo back, it needs to embrace its role as the legislature that makes laws. And you make laws by assembling majorities. And so, I think the question I've always had is, how do we get the moderates to feel more organized such that they're the ones making demands and assembling, in the service of assembling these coalitions, whether the speaker is so happy about it or not. And the Problem Solvers Caucus has done some very good work in that regard, but in some ways I find the group less assertive than I wish it was.
They're less willing to yield their votes in opposition to stop something, for sure, because most of the problem solvers are more pragmatists than ideologues. And so they're just different group of people. And one of my favorite words in the entire U.S. Constitution is also one of the smallest ones. It's the word all. It's the first word of the first article, the first section of the Constitution. All. It's a pretty inclusive word. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested or entrusted in the Congress of the United States, which will consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. So all the legislative power that our founders bestowed, that they granted herein in the Constitution, was given to this body, the Congress. And they had to wrestle between the states and the people, the House Representatives and the Senate, to come up with some type of agreement. There never was this idea that the president's going to write legislation and say, because I got voted by all the people, you have to do this. It's not even remotely where the founders were at intellectually, or they didn't want the country to run that way, because the revolution itself was in opposition to a monarchy, to a power. In fact, John Quincy Adams, after he served president, went back and served in the House of Representatives. Can you imagine a president today lowering himself to serve in the House of Representatives, but that's where the power resided in the earliest days. And the Congress is just, they've not embraced this at all. And I agree both with what you two just said regarding some of the rules changes. But the one rule change that they needed, they didn't push for. And that is that you needed to wrest power away from committee chairmen. Because if they don't arrest power away from committee chairmen, and committee chairmen are subject to the speaker still got too much power. And the way you wrest power away from committee chairmen is by having committee chairmen selected by the members of the committee. Because then that chairman would be beholden to the members of the committee rather than the speaker who selects them. And the most significant change they could have made is done that. And then you would begin to devolve power back to the members, and that great wisdom of the crowd that you speak of in your book could emerge. But right now, the citizens that are represented by Kevin McCarthy in California, those citizens, the wisdom of that crowd has way more say. And the wisdom of the crowd in Northeast Wisconsin has none. And that's where this whole idea of the wisdom of the crowd breaks down, because those members were the proxy. They're the vote. They're to say, here's what Northeast Wisconsin, or here's what Dan's district in Illinois feels about this or that. This is what the citizens say about this or that. And then they place their card in the machine and vote. And that's the only way that the wisdom of the crowd can emerge through this elected body and begin to be heard again. But that gets stopped because everything is being driven by the top.
Well, one thing I say, anyone who is in this room, watches this, if there's one thing besides reading Phil's book that I want you to take out of this, if you don't know it, Congress is Article 1 of the Constitution. Yes. It is restart out all legislative power there. I don't think most Americans know that or understand that. They think the president is the leader of everything. The president is supposed to make policy for the country. He's supposed to make laws for the policy. And I mean, the wisdom of, I've gone back in the last couple of years and looked at the Federalist Papers, just the wisdom of, the men who wrote the Constitution. And this idea is a vast, very diverse country. Even at the time of the founding, it was a diverse country. How do we keep people together? Well, everyone needs to feel like that they have a voice through their representative. And I go back to, there are not just two ways of thinking. There's not a red way and a blue way. There's a lot of diversity across the country. And we need those voices to come in. And this is a diversity. I mean, I think you could paint this as a diversity issue, is we're not hearing all the different voices across the country. And that's the way it was meant to be.
I would teach classes at the high school level. Schools would invite you to come in as a member of Congress to talk about how Congress works. And I would take this high school class, and I would say, today we're going to create a House and Senate in here, and we're going to vote on where we're going to lunch. And we would divide the room up, and then they would have to deliberate and come to a conclusion about where they were going to go to lunch that day. Except as they were deliberating, I would walk around and I'd give somebody a card, and on the card said, I'm shellfish allergic. And another card might say, I've got an allergy to peanuts. And I'd go around and I would basically sabotage it to try to show that the diversity all had to be brought into consideration to get to a conclusion. And it is the strength of that diversity that actually, if Congress is allowed to let it emerge, could actually be something extraordinarily powerful today. But they've got to allow it. That means they must give up power themselves and give it back to you all.
So I want to double back to this issue that everyone's hit upon about recent speakers being so powerful. In fact, we got an audience question that came in on this very topic. A speaker is just a single person in a chamber of 435. How is this person so powerful? What's the sources of the power? Who would like to take that one? Who wants to start?
Oh yeah, who wants to start on that one? You want to?
I can tell you my take on it.
Sure.
I think members like it that way. Listen, when you observe continued dysfunction in any organization, in a business, in a Congress, in a marriage, if you continue to observe dysfunction, you have to ask the question, who's winning as a result of this dysfunction? And then you can identify why the dysfunction exists. When you relinquish power to somebody else, when the Congress relinquishes it to the president, when the members relinquish it to the speaker, they have someone to blame when they go home. And they can say, man, I was fighting against this, but I got stopped by the speaker. I was fighting for this, but the president wouldn't let us. But I'm still going to be there fighting for you tomorrow. And you've got somebody to blame. They get to carry the weight of any bad decision. And I think members like that. I think they want to be protected as opposed to wanting to actually hold the power that was their rightful, they're the rightful heirs of that power based on the electorate that sent them there. I don't think they want it.
The old observation about legislative politics is that politicians either want to claim credit or they want to shift blame. And to claim credit, you at least have to engage in a credible amount of action to be able to say that you achieved something, whereas you're suggesting blame shifting seems a lot easier. You just sit back and say, well, I tried, but the forces
easiest
were
vote in
against me.
Congress to take is the no vote. You could win re-election every single year and vote no on everything.
Dan, you want in?
I want to add to that because I think there's some truth in that, and a lot of people lay that as the primary reason why members of Congress give up power, so they can't get blamed, they could shift blame. I also think that, and maybe especially because I'm coming out of the Democratic Party, it's just the idea. Reid talked about how Democrats and Republicans don't mix. This idea that our party has all the answers, and members come in, and first of all, a lot of members who come into, new members now just get elected, they don't know anything different. And it's been this way for many years. They don't know how to legislate. They don't even think of the idea that I'm going to come in and actually be able to participate in this legislative process. They're thinking, I got elected, I'm here for the team. And there's so much of that. I'm here for the team, and if the leader of the team says, well, you've got to follow along, then you say, okay, I'm here for the, we got to get, because we need to defeat the evil other side, and you're told, well, if you don't go along, that evil other side can win. We all need to stay together, or else the evil other side could win. And that's a part of it. Some of it, members don't even know what they could possibly do in being a legislator. And some of it is speakers are given a heck of a lot of power. And when you get the idea that if I want anything done here, I need to, it's like, I got to go to the king or queen. And if they will do something that I want to get done, I can go home and take credit for, I need to go to them. I need to get them to make it happen. And therefore, I can't cross them in any way. I better follow along until I get my chance to ask for my favor from the monarch. I think that's also part of what's going on.
I think both of your answers explain a lot about sort of the stickiness of the current moment. But I guess, again, I take some hope from the longer history of the place, because I think to some extent those forces are always at work. And I think it's still within the realm of serious possibilities for members to sort of feel like this thread is played out, to at some point feel like being the good partisan team player is just not worth it anymore, because your own party has gotten so twisted up in its own sort of self-defense rather than actually solving the people's problems and doing the people's work. And so I do think, politics, congressional politics, it's gotten kind of boring, right? I mean, the debt ceiling fight, that's exciting in a certain kind of way, but actually, if you know how to watch, it was pretty darn predictable and pretty boring. And
Something that happens 100% of the time is likely to happen again.
yes, the media does its darndest to turn this into a good story, but it's so predictable and it's so sterile, and it's not going to solve our problems. It's not going to produce anything interesting. If you really feel like it's important that we come up with some novel solutions to the problems facing the country, Congress can be an engine of that. It really is a better place to be an engine of that than the executive branch. The executive branch is not really cut out for creativity. It's cut out for executing the laws that are already on the books. And so Congress, think of an issue like immigration, which is one of the chapters, a sort of case study in my book. There's such a widespread sense that our immigration system is broken in so many different ways, and an awful lot of common sense people feeling like we ought to be able to make a deal, right? We ought to be able to make a deal that does something about the border and the problem with our immigration courts being so blocked up, and that does something for all these people stuck in this legal gray world. There's so many different aspects of it, and it's just waiting for Congress to pass a law, and we all kind of know that in some sense, but we've all given up on it, and we're hoping that somehow the president can use some COVID statute to make it all work out, even though nobody really believes that that's going to work too well. Congress engages in ways of helping him cover up for the ways he's sort of fudging the statutory powers. So the need is there. The chance to break things open and come up with solutions in Congress is there. We need some people to show some bravery, to show some willingness to realize that holding on to their office is not the most important thing. And I mean, Dan is somebody who had the courage of his convictions and suffered the consequences for it, unfortunately. But I don't think you feel all that much regret about that.
No.
And we need people to think actually doing the people's work is more important than that being having a sense of being an obedient team player.
I also think that strategically, though, on immigration, Republicans are basically taking the posture that they will not do anything on immigration until they do border security. Don't talk about any of this other stuff until the border is secure, then we'll talk about these other things. The problem with that from a tactical standpoint is there's nothing to trade with the other side. Big comprehensive bills allow you to put in things that both sides hate. And that's really what is the magic in writing legislation in big things, is you've got to have enough that each side gives up something so that each side can get something. But when you narrow in just so on one single thing, like border security, you're not going to get anything else, it just makes it virtually impossible to move it. They need to be more comprehensive in how they think, so tactically they can do something big like immigration reform.
So my question about the speaker, I want to pivot away from that, but I said it's very interesting that in part that, we know the speaker has formal powers, what's going to get voted upon? Well, the speaker's going to have a lot to do with that. Who sits on the Rules Committee? Well, speaker's going to have a lot of sway there. But also a lot of the power comes from simply other legislators thinking the speaker has power or simply giving that power away. Now, my last question before we do the audience questions is to ask each of you, you've lamented about the state of Congress. What can be done to fix it? And I want to start with you, Dan, then Reid, and then Phil.
You shouldn't never start with me on a question like that, looking for something, looking for hope. I spent many years thinking this has to get better. This has to return to working. I came in 2005, and things still, his second Bush term was starting, some things still got done. There were some things done in a bipartisan way. After the 2008 election, President Obama gets elected, the Republicans, to me at that point, the Republicans became much more partisan. And I call this sectarian partisanship, where you just, it's the team, and we just hate the other side. We can't even talk to them, much less compromise with them. And then 2016, President Trump gets elected, Democrats go off in that same direction. I wondered, there was a time in 2013, 2014 where I said, I keep saying things have to get better, and I finally quit saying things need to get better. I'm glad I said that before Donald Trump was elected. We've seen, as Phil talks about in the book, we've seen historically there have been revolts. Members get tired of this, and there's a revolt. The problem now that I see is members are more concerned about losing a primary than losing the general election. So they're in who has the power in the primaries. It's the more extreme members, more extreme voters in your party. I certainly know this myself. That's where the activists are. That's where the workers in the primary campaigns come from. All small dollar donations. I tell you, try getting small dollar donations when you're not saying the world's going to end if you don't send me $5, $10, $20. Look, Donald Trump raised most from small dollar donors than anyone in history has. That's a major problem. And I would guess that these members, 11 Republican members who voted against the rule this week, I would guess, I don't know if it's true, that they went home and they heard from their activists, how did you let this happen? How did you let this terrible deal happen? You need to do something. And they thought, well, what can we do? Oh, well, we'll show now that we're not going to go along. We're not going to play along. And this is what we're going to do: is vote against this rule on a bill that we want passed. But we need to show it because the activists, the people who we are really listening to, are calling for this. When does it change? I don't know. Very quickly, I remember in December of 2020, all this talk about is in voting to certify the electors in each state. I remember there was a called Problem Solvers Caucus, and there were Republican members who were saying, the phone doesn't stop ringing. People are protesting outside my office. They're all saying you have to vote no. And I mean, they felt that pressure. And I usually never would ever, in my 16 years, suggest it to another member what they should do. But I said, look, there's a time you have to be willing to stand up and say, I'm willing to lose my job over this because this is so important. And I thought maybe I would, I sort of felt like to some extent I did that. But they were just so, they're like, this is probably it. If I vote for the, certify electors, that's it. And they're listening to this very vocal minority, but they have a sway. And that's the thing that, how do we get away from that? How do we get, human nature doesn't change. How do we get members who are willing to say, I think this is, and it's not that it's not just they're saving themselves. You also buy into, we have the answers and my party has the answers. All the answers. Those are the things that somehow has to be broken, and I don't have the answer to that. So I'm hoping one of the two of you does.
Yeah, I don't think there's a good answer. I've never been more fearful for the Republic than I am in this time. I thought typically it is a crisis moment where you see Congress begin to function, whether it's the Civil War, World War I or II. You saw the Congress really emerge and become very, very effective. I actually thought January 6th would have been a triggering event in the history of the country. The first time we lacked a peaceful transfer of power, that would have been an event that would have caused people to pause. But the speed in which misinformation, disinformation can move through the internet today is shocking and profoundly damaging. And I confess to you, and I wish it wasn't so much this way, that I went into Congress a bit cynical. I ran because I was cynical. And I left Congress more cynical than when I went in. The challenge that we have right now is the American people must do a better job at selecting and promoting leaders, and then holding their feet to the fire to lead. And we need a president who's willing to actually use moral hazard to force the Congress the president must relinquish its own power and force the Congress through moral hazard to do their work. And I think that's ultimately what it'll take. That'll probably be triggered by some crisis moment in the country. But if I had a solution, I will say this: the Committee on Modernization was a really good first step. It only works in the House. It wasn't working in the Senate. Didn't do it. But if we could just get the House to function normally again, that would be helpful. And I think they came up with some really good ideas. And so, but I've spoken hundreds of audiences since I left Congress. I'll frequently ask the question, how many of you would give the Congress of the United States an approval rating above 25%? And I'll tell you, I hardly ever see a hand go up. And that tells you that people are dismayed by Congress. The striking disconnect, however, the dissonance in it all, is the fact that they keep reelecting their own member. They hate the Congress, but they love their person. Now, Phil, the professional. What do you think?
Well, the book closes with three scenarios, which are, I think, some of the more fun chapters of the book. They start with dispatches from the future, written by observers in 2039, the 250th birthday of Congress, looking back and thinking about where the institution has gotten to by then. And the three scenarios are called decrepitude, rubber stamp, and revival. And I have to admit, the first two chapters of that set of three were a lot easier to write than the third one. It sort of doesn't require too much imagination to imagine Congress getting hollowed out, even more than it is today. We should emphasize Congress is not a completely broken place by any stretch of the imagination. Some good things still happen there, and those things could get more screwed up than they are today. And so the revival chapter, yeah, I kind of agree. It kind of seems like we need a real shock to the system to cause this kind of revolt, to cause this kind of willingness to shake things up, because as long as things sort of stay within the lines that we're familiar with today, members are going to keep making the same choices. So that's a hard reality to face. But if I was going to offer some reforms on the margin, which I'm certainly willing to do, I do think devolving power to the committees is an important thing to do. And I like the idea that Reid floated before of having members elect their own chairman. I also just like the idea of guaranteeing committees floor time. Part of the problem today is if you make yourself a diligent workhorse in a committee and make yourself a policy expert and work on writing really good bills with your fellow committee members, they may not actually go anywhere. They may not even be considered by your own chamber, let alone have a chance to become laws. So the more we could do to actually guarantee that, hey, if you're willing to go be a workhorse in Congress, if you're willing to put in the time and write good legislation on hard subjects, you're going to at least have a chance to get it passed into law. That would be a very healthy change in incentives to get some people with ambition to realize that they can make something of those ambitions as legislators and not just as performers who use their perches in Congress to get attention.
All right, the time we have left, let's go to audience questions. Gentleman in the front row.
Thank you very much.
The microphone's coming to you. Excellent.
Thank you very much. My name is Tom Dine. I worked in the Senate for 10 years in the 1970s and then worked around both houses, leading different organizations afterwards. I'm a product of the Cold War and the Vietnam War. And I saw things coming apart right in front of our eyes when members didn't want to harm the executive to push the button if they had to. Incoming missiles, whatever it required to stave off the Soviet Union. In doing so, I also watched, particularly in the Senate, because I spent 10 years there, the authorizing committees giving up power. And the appropriators, particularly starting with the House, therefore became kingmakers afterwards. At least that's how I led different organizations, if you will, to deal with members. So, Phil, I look forward to reading you because I agreed so much to your opening, but we all love Madison, we all love whoever have. But then again, 74, the Vietnam War, Gingrich's role. Can you expand some?
Yeah,
I could
so
go on here, but I don't.
That's chapter 4 and 5 of the book. So crack it open. And I should mention to members here in person, books are on that table for you to take. So please help yourselves when we break. I will say that in that era that you mentioned, when there was such a profound loss of trust in government, there was a chance, I think, for the legislature to sort of rise in people's estimation. And so a famous book that I like very much was written in 1980 called The Decline and Resurgence of Congress. So seeing the 70s as a time of resurgence for the institution, in large part because of Watergate and the ways that Vietnam led people to be suspicious of the executive. And so looking back on the era when you worked in the Senate, it was a very exciting time in terms of ambition and reshaping the place. Really a lot of energy in the halls of Congress. But I'd say unfortunately they didn't succeed in sort of settling on a model that would really take advantage of Congress's distinctive institutional capacities. Specifically, you sort of saw a shift from legislation to oversight in the 70s, and a sense that it wasn't always so important whether you passed the laws. You could just hold these subcommittee hearings, and there were a huge proliferation of subcommittees with staff at this time, and they did a lot of... Exactly, yeah. And so I think they created by the Carter administration kind of a sense that Congress was just a big mess. And cacophony is the word that I use in my chapter title. So that sort of left a problem to be solved, but unfortunately we didn't try to solve it with the Madisonian logic. We turned to the Wilsonian logic more and more from the mid-1980s onward. And people who were frustrated with Congress, like a young Newt Gingrich, they brought a very Wilsonian sensibility to American politics. They did not believe in rehabilitating the Congress as a place of factional competition, really. Newt Gingrich, from his very first campaign in the mid-70s, was saying Congress is a corrupt, terrible place. We need to take the brooms, clean out the stables, and when he relentlessly campaigned against the institution. And even when he became the Speaker of the House, he was in a sense oriented against the coalition building logic of Congress, and he very much came in a Wilsonian way saying, we have a mandate from the people. We gave them the contract with America. We won the midterms. President Clinton only won because of Ross Perot. Time to do what the Republicans want after all those decades of doing things the Democratic way. And he didn't really have legislative sensibilities, is my argument in the book. He was not a coalition builder by disposition. And so he tried to smash a lot of things through without much regard for even what the Senate would think of it, let alone how he would get President Clinton on board. He just sort of expected that his moment had arrived and everything would work out. And the puzzle to me is that model was really not that successful. Republicans in the mid-90s did not roll back the Great Society. That was their ambition, and they failed. Welfare reform is the signal exception where they got something important passed. But by and large, their agenda just failed. But nevertheless, the Gingrich model has stuck. And if you look at the idea of centralized House leadership sort of running things from their hip pocket, that was Gingrich's idea. It was the idea of Jim Wright, who he had relentlessly hounded out of office in 1988. And I think we need to get away from this way of thinking. I think the part of the book's ambition is to try to say there is another way of thinking about this institution. we need to get away from this Wilsonian, everything's going to be decided in the elections mentality, because frankly, elections just can't carry that much weight.
There were 37, when I was in Congress, there were 37 committees and subcommittees that had authority in some way over health care. 37. So they each could write rules and offer legislation on health care, but they were all in their own silos. And so it's no wonder that this thing all comes unglued. And so I did the radical thing. Republicans were in control. I was a Republican. So in the rules, when we were setting up the rules for the 115th Congress, I offered a rule change to create a committee on health care. But that would remove the ability of these 37 other committees to do fundraising in the healthcare industry. You would have thought that the whole world was going to come unglued. It's the single biggest expense the federal government has. When you add Medicare and Medicaid and all the VA benefits and everything that's surrounded by healthcare, and there's no single source or single place where experts can reside and deal with one of the most important issues for the American people today.
Well, I regret to inform you all that we've hit the 75th minute, but let me say this. For those of you who braved the smog, feel free to stick around afterwards. Everyone's going to be here, and we're happy to chat. For those of you who are watching out there, thank you for tuning in. And if we can we please get a round of applause for our panel? Thank you. All right.